Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 20th of February 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. Oxfam.
Oxfam, yes. Oxfam was in front of the International Development Committee this morning. We've got Mark Goldring, who's the Chief Executive of Oxfam, Caroline Thompson, Chair of the Trustees, and Winnie Byanyima, Executive Director of Oxfam International. Now, Stephen Twigg MP, who's the Chair of the International Development Committee, has announced a full inquiry into what he called sexual exploitation in the aid sector. He said that the International Development Committee would publish terms of reference very soon. So then it came to questioning the Oxfam staff. Mark Goldring said he's very sorry. We are very sorry for the damage Oxfam has done both to the people of Haiti but also to wider efforts for aid and development by possibly undermining public support. Caroline Thompson and Winnie Byanyima were ashamed of what had happened in Haiti, and so they described it as painful. They have yesterday released a redacted version of an internal report from 2011, and that shows that 3 of the people accused of sexual misconduct in Haiti had then subsequently physically threatened witnesses during the investigation, the internal investigation. It showed that 1 Oxfam employee was dismissed, 3 resigned. The 2 more were dismissed for bullying and intimidation, one of whom also downloaded pornography, and that 1 was sacked for failing to protect staff. The report says that the charity director of operations in Haiti, the report says Roland van Harameren, is that how you pronounce his name, had admitted using prostitutes at his Oxfam residence in Haiti. But of course, last week in the press, he was denying paying prostitutes for sex. And so there is the report saying using and the media saying paying, or at least he's saying that he's denying paying. So whether that's a fine distinction or not, I'm not sure. But then he was allowed to leave in what the report describes as a phased and dignified exit. And also during the hearing in front of the International Development Committee, it became clear that one of the people that was removed by Oxfam was then re-employed by Oxfam on a short-term contract in another country. So they still have some questions to answer here, but as I say, International Development Committee going to launch an inquiry into the aid sector as a whole. I don't know if you've any thoughts.
What my thought is that they say they're going to do that, Mike, and they're not going to do that. It's another smokescreen. I think the thing we've got to remember is in the background, we supposedly have got a UK-wide child sexual abuse inquiry going on. I know that fairly recently another key witness withdrew from that inquiry because they didn't have any faith in the work of the inquiry. They didn't have any faith in the inquiry being able to protect them. So we are dragging child abuse into the long grass, particularly, of course, where the finger's been pointed at politicians, Westminster and the establishment. John Wedgers stood up to be counted on that as a former Met Detective Constable, and we have absolutely no real progress. Now all of a sudden we're attacking the charity base. Remember, these are the units which are supposed to help us form political policy under participatory democracy. This is the agenda. These charities make the decisions. So what do I see coming out of this? I think it's a smokescreen for the official child abuse inquiry, muddy the waters. The government is also taking control of the charities. It's making them fearful. It's putting the people under pressure. And the other thing we can see coming through with it is more controls of the internet as a result of what's happened. So I think this is a very carefully contrived situation. The abusers have been allowed to do their business. They've been encouraged. You've just said here these people were allowed to leave in a phase exit. That's encouraging them because they haven't been brought to book. So the government has allowed the abuse to spread it then brings in the iron fist to crush it because the government itself can get advantage from it. That's what I think is going on.
It's interesting you bring up the issue of the internet because in parallel with that today, the NSPCC has produced this report, you could call it. Child sex offence recorded on average every 8 minutes in the UK. They're saying the number of child sex offences recorded in the UK has risen by 15%, according to new figures that the NSPCC obtained from the police. Child sex offences recorded by police rose to a record 64,667 last year. They recorded crimes against children, including rape, sexual assault and grooming. And of the 64,667 recorded child sexual offences, 13,876 were against children aged 10 or under, 2,788 were against children aged 4 or under, 193 were against babies under the age of 1, and 1 in 10 were flagged as having an online element, which is a 59% increase on the previous year. The reasons for the rise, well, they're speculating a little here. They're saying a number of factors could have contributed to the rise, including police force improved recording methods, children and young people feeling more confident in disclosing abuse following high-profile cases, and that online groomers becoming a significant problem. Well, okay, the levels of online grooming have risen by 59%, but it's risen to 10% of the overall recorded criminal activity. So it's still a pretty small proportion of what's going on out there, Brian. And yet, if you look through the mainstream media coverage of this today, they're mainly focusing on the online aspect of this.
Well, this is the diversionary tactic, Mike, isn't it? It's always drift people away from the reality of what's happening onto some other, subsidiary issue. Yeah. And I just find it outrageous that NSPCC is constantly put forward to be the overall organisation on child abuse, when we know that survivors of abuse point a finger at the NSPCC itself. So if it's going on in Oxfam, why shouldn't similar abuses be going on inside the NSPCC? And yet this is also the charity that was manning the phones if people contacted the Met Police to report abuse. So there's no separation of powers. The Met Police, who've stamped down John Wedger, were using NSPCC to man their phones. You thought you were talking to the police. In fact, you were talking to NSPCC. That's a pretty powerful position to be in.
Yes. And in the meantime, the National Crime Agency has updated events on Operation Stovewood, which is the inquiry into, or actually a range of police inquiries, 34 investigations in total into the Rotherham child abuse scandal, if you want to call it that. They're saying that the number of children believed to have been exploited in Rotherham has risen to 1,510. That's up from 1,400 identified during the J report in 2014. So 34 investigations make up Operation Stovewood. It's identified 110 subjects, 80% are of Pakistani heritage, they say. 38 have been arrested, 18 have been charged, 2 have been cautioned, 4 have been convicted, and as you can see on screen, they announced the latest conviction a couple of days ago. Of the 1,510 potential victims, they said 260, that's 17%, are speaking to officers at the moment. But the police aim to talk to everyone that's been affected by this. They say the vast majority of victims were white British girls aged 11 to 18. Now, I had an email this morning from somebody in the area saying that, you know, the issue here is that it's outside forces that are uncovering these extra additional victims. South Yorkshire Police itself continues to cover up child abuse. No one within South Yorkshire Police or Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council has been prosecuted. No politicians have been expelled. And again, I'm going to say to people, if you have not yet read the Common Purpose Effect series of articles on the UK Column website, please do so. This was the original one, the Rotherham Common Purpose Effect, where we were asking why were these child abuse rings allowed to operate for so long? Why was nothing done about it? We did not buy the story that it was because the council, the people responsible within the council were concerned about being accused of being racist in some way. This just did not add up, and we're putting forward an explanation for what has been going on. Please have a read at those articles, and more importantly, share them if you haven't read them so far.
And if I can just add to that, Mike, we still can't talk about this fully because of court proceedings which are still going on. But in Sheffield, it is quite clear that where abuse is identified in the immigrant communities, where mothers come forward, often mothers who have got very little English, those mothers coming forward to report child abuse, they are then victimised, bullied and hounded by the local authority, the social services. Police are also involved, and on several occasions the names of the mothers have then been leaked back into the communities so that they've been beaten up or raped as a result of so-called snitching to the authorities. So we'll pin it down. The white authorities are the people that are facilitating the abuse. But of course, when the finger's pointed, surprise, surprise, the abusers are always Asian or non-whites. Contrast that situation when the finger is pointed towards Westminster, Prime Minister Ted Heath, other MPs, then all of a sudden, no, there's nothing to see. There's absolutely nothing going on here. There is something very nasty happening at the moment, and the evidence certainly coming into the UK column is that we are to believe the abusers are always Asian, but the people actually facilitating it appear to us to be very senior political and establishment figures who are white.
Now, right across the mainstream media today, we've had coverage of bad news. Brian, this is a new app on the internet. It's fantastic. It will help you identify fake news.
We must get it, Mike.
We have to get it, yes. So it is a game, apparently. You take the role of a fake news monger, drop all pretense, they say, of ethics, and choose the path that builds your persona as an unscrupulous media magnate. Are you an unscrupulous media magnate?
Well, I don't think I should comment on that.
Okay, but keep an eye on your followers and credibility meters. Your task is to get as many followers as you can while slowly building up fake credibility as a news site. But watch out, you lose if you tell obvious lies or disappoint your supporters. So who's behind this? Well, DROG, or whatever, I don't know how you help. Drog or something. They develop programs and courses and conduct research aimed at recognizing disinformation, especially online. They say that they're a multidisciplinary team of academics, journalists and media experts. They conduct research, give talks, offer workshops and educational programs, and create innovative tools that help you build resistance to disinformation. So there you go. Their team apparently is from all over Europe, but their headquarters are in The Hague. So the question is, who's behind this little organization? Well, it's this organization, the Stimulation Fund for Journalism, which is a fund to support journalism in the Netherlands. It was established originally called the Press Fund in September 1974 to financially support ailing press organizations, right? And who's behind it? The Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science. And they receive 2.3 million euros a year. So this is a Dutch government project designed to underpin a failing media, sort of mainstream media organization. And they have produced this little app, which is going to help us identify and build resistance to disinformation and identify fake news when we see it. I feel much better knowing that it's there.
Good. I think I'll just say to our viewers and listeners, do what we do and use your intuition and common sense to decide whether you think something's fake news or not. Fake news, we better go to The Guardian. We've mentioned this man, Andrew Adonis, before. He's been touring the country, trying to stir up the Remainers to get this disgraceful Brexit vote overturned. This was part of the article here. The first step along what Andrew Adonis hopes is the road to reversing Brexit starts a few miles upstream from where it all began 19 months ago. fresh from introducing proposals for a second referendum into the House of Lords. The Labour peer travelled to Durham on Friday to begin a national tour that aims to convince the poll-weary country to think again. And I had a little bit of information come through this morning, which says it would appear that as well as promoting the Remain point of view, Lord Adonis has been carrying out little interviews with people who want to leave, and seems to be hoovering up information, no doubt to get a better understanding of what would make somebody think such a dreadful thing as we'd be better off outside the European Union. But of course this is The Guardian, and you can never quite believe the text on the page with The Guardian. You always have to look behind it. Now this man you mentioned a little while ago, Mike, Femi Oluwole, if I pronounced that correctly. This gentleman gets promoted in the Guardian article, and he's a very interesting character. So if we have a look at the detail here, he says that he's a law grad who spends his time telling both Remainers and Brexiteers the stuff about the EU nobody else bothers to, human rights advocate. And what else can we get out of this? Well, it links through to another website, which we'll come to in a minute. And if I can just draw your attention to this bit, we've got basically 21.4 thousand tweets, which has produced 34.3 thousand followers, which seemed feasible to me, Mike. I don't know how you feel about that, but they've pumped out a lot of tweets. I don't know how he's got time for law, but he's been able to put out a lot of tweets, and they've picked up quite a lot of followers. Okay. So I'm going to say, so we accept that. Well, this is where it links through to. This is Our Future, Our Choice. Brexit will be a drastic blow to our future. The young from all backgrounds and regions are against it. We must stop it. So there is Femi, second in from the right. And my goodness, they've been busy. They're promoting a young man who's in London saying how dreadful everything is. That's the embedded video. And this is one of the images that comes up on screen, a message to Westminster from Finsbury Park. And the majority of politicians just don't get it. The country's falling apart. And basically this is all because of leaving the EU, apparently, Mike. But this is the other bit to this. Notice these figures for this site, that it had put out a mere 446 tweets, but it had 15,800 followers. And I think that's a pretty good ratio, bearing in mind how our figures seem to often go down as opposed to up. So let's go and look at this man in a bit more detail. Here he is. He says this: young people are the answer. Another referendum is the only way to reverse this without civil unrest. It's one of those rare situations where two wrongs will make a right. So essentially, I think there's a bit of a threat there.
That's the impression I got, a little bit of a threat.
Yeah, get the referendum right, or you're going to be facing civil unrest. Yes. Does he know something we don't? Didn't he understand what he said? We don't know. So if we go back to The Guardian, the clue starts to form, because it said this: the plan is to appeal to Corbyn's young supporters, who happen to be the most passionate Remainers. Central to this is to try and make sure the figurehead is not the unelected peer who once advocated tuition fees, but instead the focus is on a group of student activists who are accompanying Adonis on the road and leading their own messaging online. So a bit of a dig at him, because at one stage he wasn't too keen on the tuition fees, but basically he's going to be leading these youngsters. So let's look at Femi again, and he boasts here that he's got a law degree from the University of Nottingham, and he says, unlike most, including Remainers, I've actually studied EU law. So
I presume he hasn't studied British law then?
Doesn't appear to have studied British law, doesn't appear to have studied the Constitution, doesn't appear to have studied common law at all, but he's boasting that you can sort of take his viewpoint. We need to stay in the EU because he studied EU law. He says this: your vote shapes EU policy in 2009, and there he brings in the Lisbon Treaty, because he said that basically suitable changes were made to make the EU more accountable. So there's no problem.
So he's been campaigning for the EU for quite a number of years then.
He's been campaigning.
Hasn't just suddenly come out of the woodwork to deal with this ridiculous situation of Brexit?
No, this is a special young man. I mean, the vast majority of people under the age of 55. Now, that was your point, Mike, that essentially this guy is saying that if you're in the older bracket, we need to get rid of you because you're interfering with the Remain thing. So this was one of the screenshots I got from his Twitter page, I think it was. I've also worked in EU affairs for 3 years.
Unfortunately, you can't spell that.
This is true. That isn't a typo by me for a change. So no, he can't spell that. But so this is actually a still from the little video, embedded video, so people can go and see this. I've also worked in the EU affairs for 3 years, to which I say that this is a reframed EU change agent. Now, I just noticed this, that if you have a look in the background, we can see the organisations that he's worked for. So if we bring those in, this is one of the organisations, and it's the European Centre for Democracy and Human Rights. What do they say about themselves? Non-profit organisation based in Brussels and registered in Dublin, and is the EU representation of a coalition of other like-minded NGOs. Do you get where this is going, Mike?
Yeah.
Right? So this young man is involved with this very nebulous organisation. I did what we usually do, which is go and have a look at the funders. And I've got the National Endowment for Democracy. Now, this filled me with confidence, because this is obviously people looking after democracy. Well, I'm going to encourage people to go and have a look at this little team, because we've got all sorts of people, most of them big finance people, Carlson Holdings Incorporated, but we've also got Carnegie, and we've got the Council on Foreign Relations as a starter. So this is not an ordinary organisation. This is
not an ordinary young man either.
Not an ordinary young man, no. So we've had a look at one of those funders. Let's come in at the other one here. This is the other one, which is Civicus. Now, this is really excellent. Here's Civicus, nice logo. What have they got to say about themselves? They say this: Civicus is a global alliance of civil society organisation and activists dedicated to strengthening citizen action and civil society around the world. We're striving to promote marginalised voices, not the 17 million people that voted in UK to come out of the EU. It's not going to support them. But here's this young man tied in with a very interesting linked, I have to say, to a very interesting organisation. And what did I find pretty quickly? That this organisation, Civicus, was outraged that people were attacking George Soros.
Yes.
A major article that how dreadful that anybody should point a finger at Soros. I haven't yet found the direct Soros link, but I know it's there. And so if we remember those tweets, you put out 446 tweets, you end up with 16,000 followers. I wonder whether he had a little bit of help from the Soros Open Society.
Well, he's had a huge amount of help, not only from Soros-backed groups, but from mainstream media. So that explains why there's been such interest in it. The Guardian, in particular, has been pushing this extremely hard. Independent, I think, as well. So you then get the strange ratio between the number of tweets and the number of followers.
Things put out.
Yes.
But what that young man isn't is an ordinary young man in Britain who's putting his personal opinion across. He has been trained and worked within the EU and worked within the very organisations which boast that they're going to change civil society, whether we like it or not.
Okay, another day, another fake news story in The Guardian about Syria, and what looks like a fake news, a fake photograph on the front as well. Very, very Omranish in its staged appearance. Well, what have we got here? Assad regime uses barrel bombs and attacks hospitals in rebel-held eastern Ghouta. let's just remember these are not rebels in eastern Ghouta. These are terrorists. It's Al-Nusra Front and ISIS. They are themselves firing hell cannons every day at people in the main part of Damascus. So this report saying more than 100 people have been killed and hundreds wounded on a day of hysterical violence in the opposition-controlled enclave of eastern Ghouta in Syria. The surge in the killing came amid reports of an impending regime incursion into the area outside Damascus, which is home to 400,000 civilians. Let's get something straight. The mainstream media is starting to panic now because the final areas held by Al-Nusra Front and ISIS are about to be liberated, large parts of Idlib province as well as eastern Ghouta. And the mainstream media does not want that to happen because they know that once it does, there are going to be reports from the ground from civilians in the area telling people what was really going on in those areas while they've been under the occupation of the terrorists. And they don't want these reports coming to light, as they didn't in eastern Aleppo, for example. So the same narrative that we had from East Aleppo, now for eastern Ghouta, people bombing hospitals and all the rest of it, it's the same old stuff. In the meantime, well, here we are back in the UK, and exercise Toxic Dagger. This is 40 Commando Royal Marines and the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory staging the UK's biggest annual exercise to prepare troops for chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear operations. Exercise Toxic Dagger was supported by the DSTL along with Public Health England and the Atomic Weapons Establishment. The largest exercise of its kind in the country. Major Rob Garside of 40 Commando Royal Marines said, working with DSTL means we have the most up-to-date information and realistic exercise. This ensures we're well prepared for a CBRN operating environment. This is an annual thing, Brian, but bearing in mind that we're seeing continuing rumours of chemical attacks in Syria, I just wonder how related those are.
I don't know. It's very interesting, though, that this is sort of pushed into the public domain because, of course, chemical, biological warfare exercises carried out regularly through the Cold War as almost a day-by-day thing. Nobody got too excited that you were going to do one of those and put your gas mask on. But now, of course, this is sort of docudrama. We're going to push it into the public domain to help ramp up the fear factor. But I found it interesting, 40 Commando Royal Marine mentioned there, because, of course, on Saturday, HMS Ocean, the amphibious ship, has been sold for a mere 84 million. So as the UK column has been warning about for many years now, we're going to see the rest of the Royal Navy completely decimated by Theresa May's EU military unification plans. And well, what a deal, operational warship gone for a mere 84 million, but apparently the profit is going to be helping to sustain the whole of UK's defence. Is that correct?
Apparently. I'm not quite sure how much profit there is in 84 million pounds, Brian.
I would suspect nothing.
Yeah,
None.
There you go then.
Yeah.
Okay, well look, now, when did Gavin Williamson become Secretary of State for Defence? September or so, I think it was, if I remember rightly. And I think we said at that time that he was being tapped to become the next leader of the Conservative Party. Well, The Sun today saying Gavin for PM, big money Tory donor endorses Gavin Williamson as like Churchill in fresh leadership headache for PM Theresa May. The Express as well, Gavin Williamson compared to Winston Churchill and backed to be PM by top Tory donor. So what does this come out of? Well, it's come out of an article in Conservative Home. And this is Ukrainian-born Alexander Temerko, over £1 million donor to the Tory party. And he has written an article for Conservative Home here. He, of course, is the former owner of the Russian oil firm Yukos Oil. He's no longer in Russia. He's not a friend of Vladimir Putin. And he is not throwing his weight behind Gavin Williamson as the mainstream media is presenting. In fact, what they said was that somebody that he knew, a friend of his, had said something which implied that perhaps he was getting behind Gavin Williamson, but not in this article anyway, because what he said is that Russia testing NATO's resolve in the Baltic and all this is getting very dangerous. Serious discussions are taking place about cutting or merging the Royal Marines and the Paras. Questions are being asked about the need for us, a seagoing nation, to maintain an amphibious assault capability. Army numbers could fall even lower, making it almost impossible for the UK to field and sustain the same size force it had in Helmand province during the peak of the Afghan war. And he goes on to make the point that the government continues to criticize, to cut the armed forces, and that in fact what he's offering is support for Gavin Williamson's call for more treasury money to be going into the military, right? And he says at the end, by contrast, Russia has been keeping military spending at around 10% of GDP, financed by a hydrocarbon budget, and it's not doing so to show off during V-Day parades. Currently, its military capabilities stand at 2 million on-duty soldiers and officers. We know that the nation that is unwilling to feed an army of its own will feed someone else's. It's also often said that the defence of the realm is the #1 job of government, but until real money is provided to develop real capabilities, these are merely empty words bouncing across Westminster's echo chamber. The size and capabilities of our armed forces cannot be driven solely by financial considerations. The government has a duty to ensure that it pays proper heed and attention to the strategic circumstances facing the UK now and well into the future. Now is the time to get it right before it's too late. Now, I'm going to say this is a man who is anti-Putin, anti-Russia, and has perhaps a vested interest in promoting the armed forces in the UK as a foil against Putin. But at the same time, this was not about supporting Gavin Williamson as a future leader of the Tory party. This was about making the point that the British military is utterly underfunded and being decimated in front of our eyes. And so again, the mainstream media trying to divert what is a reasonable point into something sensational like leadership contests.
Yeah,
it's just more fake news, more nonsense.
More fake news, and of course what they're not doing is focusing the public view on what is actually happening in the European Union and that EU military unification. So defence is being cut and cut and cut at the moment, mainly to achieve parity with the French in order to facilitate full EU military unification, which will include the UK. So the big lie at the moment is that all the cuts are simply due to the fact there's no money. That's the great lie. The truth is the cuts are deliberate in order to facilitate the creation of a unified EU military structure, which will include everything to do with procurement. And of course, if you're going to do that, you're going to need your own treasury. So that's the reality. Well, somebody else who doesn't really seem to understand what's going on is UKIP's new interim leader, Gerard Batten. And several people contacted me pointing out this interview between Ian Dale of LBC and Gerard Batten a couple of days ago. I've spent a bit of time this morning having a look at it, and I just found it absolutely incredulous, really. Here we are. Brexit, there is no Brexit, Mike. That's very clear to everybody. So 17 million people completely betrayed. UKIP just had a disastrous leader with his name escapes me. Thank you, Henry Bolton. So what did Gerard Batten get talking about pretty quickly? Well, he allowed himself to be drawn into how big the party was, 25,000 people. And he said we need to engage more people. So no comment there about the drastically falling membership of the Conservative Party. He simply allows himself to be hammered about how the UKIP membership has fallen. But don't worry, we're going to engage more young people. So where do we go there? He said, he went on to say he believes there's a left-wing agenda in schools and colleges. We see this in other areas of society where only certain views are acceptable. And if you're not peddling the accepted view, you're in trouble. Then he said, well, we're going to go on and subsidise those degrees which would benefit industry. So Mike, in my opinion, he allowed himself just to be pushed around the ring here, because he could have said, well, of course, one of the views you're not allowed to hold is that we need to come out of the European Union if you dare criticise the EU. So this was very weak, wishy-washy stuff. So not surprisingly, Dale came in here. Isn't this the interesting thing? Other parties have taken over your policies. Do you think there's really a need for UKIP? The Tories have taken over so many of your policy platforms. So now we're really starting to pull UKIP apart. Well, there's no real need for you. Brexit has disappeared into the background at this stage. So Gerard Batten comes back in. He says the primary point of UKIP now is, and I think there are many other policies we can espouse that will be popular. We won the referendum, but the referendum has not been delivered. Brexit has not been delivered. So he just about gets it in as a minor issue, is immediately attacked. Hang on, we're leaving on the 29th of March 2019. The government's policy is to come out of the customs union, come out of the single market. What more would you like? One would have thought at this point Batten could have ripped him apart, Mike, but it just got worse. So where do we go from that? He said it's not a fully unencumbered exit. We've had Theresa talking about a security treaty, which means we're to be bound into the EU military. The EU's not about cooperation, it's about integration. We want to leave the EU completely. We don't want to pay them any money. We don't want any proportion of their laws. And also we want our fishing grounds back. Mm-hmm. So generalised comments, but there was no power, there was no substance. Presumably Mr. Batten hasn't read any of the UK column material on what's really happening. And where do we go? We got a caller from Wadebridge, Gary, and Gary said the real issue is how we get Nigel back in charge, because we've one global asset who stands on the world stage as a recognised leader who can reinvigorate and rejuvenate the party, and we have nobody else. Sorry to tell you that. So this was really eye-watering that the party has collapsed. It has been collapsed with the assistant of Nigel Farage, who recommended the last leader, Henry Bolton. And now we're just in front of the public going round in a whirlpool of nowhereness. So what was the reply to this? He said, I think the decision is up to Nigel, whether he wants to do that or not. I think probably Nigel has done as much as he can, and we need to find an identity post-Nigel. The caller says it's about refocusing the Brexit voters in the next 3-year time period, and we don't have time to develop a whole new policy. So the caller got frustrated. He said, we're running out of time. We need to do something here. Batten, just woolliness. But then we got into the really incredible stuff, because the interviewer says, you've stood by your original comments that Islam is a death cult. Do you not understand the difference between Islam and Islamism? Yeah. Get that right. So Mr. Batten said, have you ever looked at the original text? In 2005, when the bombs were in London, I was spokesman on security and defence, and I felt I needed to educate myself on the ideology that justifies these actions in these people's minds. The original Islam is funded on violence, done with conquest and invasion. It's a cult. He also says that Christianity is a benevolent cult. He says there's no such thing as moderate Islam. The problem is a bag of contradictory nonsense. So we completely leave the real issue of the European Union and Brexit aside. We don't talk about defence, but he admits that he was defence spokesman, so he should have known. And now he's dragged into this exchange about Islam. He says, what about the text in the Hadith where Muhammad says Judgment's Day will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews, and the Jews will hide behind the rocks and the trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, O Muslim, O faithful servant, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. And at which point the interviewer, looking absolutely amazed, says, I haven't been in a mosque before. Should we go into a mosque together and debate it with the congregation or those present? There was a caller who actually said, Gerard, you've got this badly wrong. I'm going to say this is an utter car crash interview. We've got clear, precise facts on what the EU is doing. We've got clear, precise facts that Theresa May is absolutely lying to the British public over Brexit. And where does Gerard Batten take it into picking a fight with the Muslim community in UK? And I just thought this was astonishing, Mike. This, of course, is what was posted up on the LBC site sometime afterwards. Gerard Batten claims kids are being brainwashed by left-wing teachers, so that's going to alienate teachers. Nigel Farage rules himself out of a fresh UKIP leadership bid. This party has been destroyed. We warned that this is what was going to happen, and now, not content with a destroyed party, they're going to help to ramp up the hate in UK by delving into this very dangerous area, when, of course, the issue on Islam is who made the policy, who created this situation in UK, and this is the bit nobody wants to talk about, Mike. I just got to say, I was astonished.
Okay, let's move on to financial stuff then. Jeremy Corbyn has been talking today about the City of London, apparently. He says that he's concerned that the city, the financial industry is not a servant of industry, but a master of us all. He said, for a generation, instead of finance serving industry, politicians have served finance. We've seen where it ends, the productive economy, our public services, and people's lives being held hostage by a small number of too big to fail banks and casino finance institutions. No more, the next Labour government will be the first in 40 years to stand up for the real economy. Will take decisive action to make finance the servant of industry, not the masters of us all. Well, if what he's hinting at here is proper separation between the banks, Glass-Steagall style, then perhaps that's a good thing. But of course, we've got to remember that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, who both signed the early day motion on the Bradbury Pound, will refuse to discuss it anymore. So we wait with interest to see what he actually means by what he said. He also was concerned about the potential buyout of GKN, one of the big engineering companies in this country. And so he said that the Labour government will broaden its scope of the public interest test, allowing government to intervene to prevent hostile takeovers which destroy our industrial base. Again, we'll see what he actually means by that in due course. Now, the City UK, which is the financial lobby, the mouthpiece of the financial lobby in the UK, they retorted slightly by saying that the financial sector brings so much to the country, 2.2 million jobs, £87 billion in tax revenue. I'm not sure that that outweighs the financial industry's disastrous consequences for the country. But anyway, to a certain degree, I agree with what Corbyn has said, but I'm more interested to know exactly what he intends to do rather than sort of being in these general terms.
Well, one of the things we should remind viewers and listeners about, of course, is that Corbyn supported the early day motion.
I just did. I said
you
that.
did that.
Yes.
Beg your pardon.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, and I wanted to highlight this article in Medium about house prices in London. Apocalypse Now, London's property crash. The author saying the average age of first-time mum in London's Chelsea and Westminster Hospital is 37, a statistic that tells you everything you need to know about the choices supposedly affluent city dwellers are being forced to make in the capital. For the middle classes, the cost of living in London, the cost of getting by, long ago went past insane. He highlights that it's £17,040 is the cost per year of educating a 4-year-old child at Thomas School in Fulham, which does not include the school uniform. He says this incredible price of property, of course, has been the engine that's driving this madness. For the last 2 decades or more, the capital's property market, to all intents and purposes, has behaved like a giant Ponzi scheme, played on a global scale. And he highlights that the average price of a London semi-detached house has gone up by 553% between 1995 and 2007, from £133,820 to £873,603. And over the same period, the average cost of a detached house in the capital went from £257,748 to £1.453 million. But he's making the point that at last the party is over. London's property prices now still flailing cartoonishly in mid-air, despite being well over the edge of a cliff. And he says that although the carnage is only just beginning in earnest, desperate homeowners are looking to sell. They're already dropping house prices by tens of thousands of pounds or more. They know the tide is going out quickly. But of course, and he highlights what the reasons for this are. The four horsemen of the capital's property apocalypse, he calls it: Brexit, knackered oil prices, the threat of a socialist government, and absolutely astonishing levels of personal debt. So it's good to see somebody highlighting this, because it is an issue that is going to hurt a lot of people very, very quickly, particularly in London, but not exclusively.
Yeah, I've been told of relatively young people who've got sort of 40-year mortgages.
Yes.
And when some of them were asked, well, how are you actually going to pay for that in later years, they simply don't want to go near that. Yeah. They've taken on vast mortgages on that basis, which is pretty frightening. Well, there we are, today's news. Just one little response to comments in our chat box. Is it important, the situation in UKIP? Personally, I think it is, because of course UKIP did engage so many people and warn them of what the EU was really about. 17 million people vote to come out. That's a very, very powerful force in the country. And then just at the time those 17 million people could really be challenging the government and demanding the proper exit from the European Union, the whole thing has been deliberately collapsed. So my personal view is that it's up to UKIP supporters to do the right thing on the ground. Don't rely on the party to do it for you. Get out there and do everything you can to get those 17 million Leave voters fully informed about the EU and taking the right action. Don't think I could put it blunter than that, Mike, but we've warned and warned what was going to be done to UKIP for so many years. We'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.